Your tomato plant is huge, dark green, gorgeous. And after months of waiting, you still don't have a single tomato to show for it. It's probably not your soil, and it's probably not the weather this time. Something else is quietly working against your harvest. And it's easy to miss because it looks a lot like really good care. Across most backyard gardens in the US, when a tomato plant flowers but never fruits, growers usually blame one of three things. First, bad soil, poor pollination, or a stretch of bad weather. Let's rule those out fast. If your leaves are deep green and your plant keeps putting out new growth every single week, your soil isn't starved. If anything, it's the opposite. Pollination trouble is real, but it usually shows up as flowers that open, hang there, and then drop off before they swell, not as a plant that barely bothers to flower in the first place. And weather stress, like a heat wave pushing daytime highs into the 90s, tends to come and go with the forecast. If your plant has been like this for weeks with no heat wave to blame, that's not what's happening to you either. So if your tomato looks strong, keeps growing, and still isn't fruiting, something else is steering it, and it's not bad luck. Here's a quick check you can run right now. Before we even get into why, walk over to your plant and look at the growing tip, the newest, softest part at the top of the main stem. If it's thick, a little curled, and pushing out new leaves faster than you can count them, hold on to that. It's going to matter in a minute. So what's actually going on? Think of your tomato plant as splitting its resources between two jobs, building itself bigger, and building the next generation flowers, then fruit, then seeds. Nitrogen is the nutrient that fuels the first job. It's the raw material behind chlorophyll and plant protein, which is why a nitrogen-rich plant looks so satisfying: thick stems, broad, dark leaves, rapid growth. You can practically watch happen. Picture it like two channels carrying the plant's resources. One channel builds leaves and stems. The other builds flowers and fruit. Heavy nitrogen widens that first channel and, without you doing anything else, narrows the second one. The plant isn't broken. It's just putting almost everything it has into growing bigger instead of reproducing. Cooperative extension researchers at the University of Arkansas describe this pattern directly. Too much nitrogen fertilizer causes excessive vegetative growth that inhibits the plant from shifting into reproductive mode, which means fewer flowers form in the first place. And horticulture specialists at the University of Missouri put it even more plainly to produce flowers. A tomato plant actually needs less nitrogen and more phosphorus, not more of everything. If you've been feeding your tomato the same all-purpose fertilizer you use on your lawn or your leafy greens, something loaded with nitrogen up front, you've likely been giving the plant exactly what it needs to keep growing and almost nothing that tells it to start flowering. Here's the part that's easy to miss, though, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This isn't your tomato malfunctioning. It's your tomato making a very old, very rational trade. In the wild, a plant that finds itself swimming in nutrients has no urgency to reproduce. It can afford to keep growing bigger. It's hella leafier because conditions are good and there's no rush. A reproduction for a plant is a stress response. As much as a growth stage, plants that sense scarcity or sense they might not survive much longer tend to rush toward flowering and seed production, almost like a plant's version of better set seed. Now, just in case, a tomato plant loaded with nitrogen is essentially getting a signal that says everything is abundant, stay in growth mode. There's no reason to hurry. Your fertilizer, meant as generosity, is telling the plant the opposite of what you actually want it to hear. That's the twist. Underneath the mistake, you're not starving your plant into failure. And you're not neglecting it. You're accidentally telling it that it's safe to keep growing forever, when what you actually want is for it to feel like it's time to get to work. There's a second layer to this that most people never hear, and it comes down to where your plant's carbon actually goes. Everything green on your tomato is running photosynthesis constantly, pulling in sunlight and turning it into sugars. That's the plant's fuel supply. Under normal conditions, a good share of that fuel gets routed toward flower development and fruit growth. Under heavy nitrogen, though, more of that same fuel gets pulled toward building new leaf tissue instead. Because leaf growth is nitrogen hungry and the plant is prioritizing the resource it has in surplus, horticultural researchers often describe this as a shift in the plant's carbon to nitrogen balance. When nitrogen is abundant relative to the plant's carbon reserves, growth tends to lean vegetative. When that ratio evens out, more of the plant's energy becomes available for reproductive structures instead. So it's not just that nitrogen sends a grow more signal, it's also quietly redirecting the actual fuel your plant would otherwise be spending on flowers and fruit. This also explains something a lot of growers notice, but never connect to fertilizer: indeterminate tomato varieties, the kind that keep growing taller and producing new stems all season instead of stopping at a set height. Tend to show this problem more dramatically than determinate varieties, which are bred to grow to a fixed size and set fruit in a shorter, more concentrated window. If you're growing an indeterminate variety, that same vine just keeps extending and leafing out for as long as conditions let it, which means excess nitrogen has more time and more plant structure to pour itself into before the plant ever feels pressure to slow down and flower. If you're growing a determinate variety and still seeing this problem, the nitrogen imbalance is usually even more pronounced, since that variety is genetically inclined to prioritize fruiting sooner and heavy nitrogen is actively working against its normal timeline. This is also why the mistake is so easy to fall into in the first place. You want to take good care of your tomato, so you feed it, and feeding feels like the responsible thing to do, especially early in the season when the plant is small and you want to give it a strong start. Garden centers across the US sell all-purpose fertilizers. And in a lot of regions, especially in the South, the default bag on the shelf is something like a balanced the 10th of October 2010, which still carries a meaningful nitrogen load. Nobody explains that a tomato plant's nutrient needs actually shift once it starts flowering. So you keep applying the same fertilizer on the same schedule, right through bloom time, because it worked in spring and nothing told you to change course. The plant rewards you with gorgeous foliage, which reads as success. So you keep doing exactly what you were doing. It's a completely reasonable mistake to make, and it's one almost every enthusiastic new tomato grower falls into at least once. It also doesn't help that a lot of hand-me-down gardening advice treats fertilizer like a single lever, feed heavy, get a heavy harvest. That kind of advice made more sense generations ago when a lot of home garden soil was genuinely depleted and any nitrogen boost was a net win. Modern garden soil, especially in raised beds or bag potting mix, often starts out richer than people assume. So the same feed and heavy habit that used to correct a deficiency now just piles nitrogen on top of a plant that didn't need more of it. And if you're feeding with a liquid fertilizer dissolved in your watering can once a week on top of a granular feed you already put down earlier in the season, that nitrogen exposure adds up fast without ever feeling like too much in the moment. Because each individual feeding looks small and reasonable on its own. Here's the good news first. And it's worth saying plainly, you don't need to start over. You don't need to rip this plant out and replace it with something new. That's usually where people jump first, straight to giving up on the plant. And it's not necessary here. A nitrogen imbalance isn't permanent damage to the plant itself. It's a signal problem, not a structural one. And from here, fixing, it comes down to 3 moves. Stop sending your plant the wrong signal, start sending it the right one, and then watch for the proof that it worked. Step 1 is stopping the wrong signal. And it starts today. Skip your next scheduled nitrogen feeding entirely. Even if it's already circled on your calendar, give the plant 1 deep, slow watering at the base right now instead of a quick pass with the hose. If you've been mulching with fresh grass clippings, manure, or a nitrogen-rich compost, pull that material back away from the base of the plant today as well. since it keeps adding nitrogen into the soil as it breaks down. Even after you've stopped fertilizing on purpose, and go check the bag or bottle of whatever you've been feeding your tomato, look at the 3 numbers on the label, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content in that order. If the first number is equal to or higher than the second, that's the fertilizer that's been sending the wrong signal all along, and it's the one to set aside. One caution, as you work through this step, stopping the wrong signal doesn't mean cutting your plant off from food completely. Some growers, once they realize nitrogen is the problem, swing all the way to 0 fertilizer out of fear of repeating the mistake, but that just trades one imbalance for another. Since your plant still needs adequate nutrition to support the fruit it's about to put energy into, step 1 is about removing the specific thing working against you, not starving the plant. Step 2 is sending the right signal, and this is where the real rebalancing happens. It's not about hunting down some rare specialty product. Most of what you need is sitting on a regular garden center shelf. You just haven't had a reason to reach for it yet. Start with a soil test. Most cooperative extension offices around the country offer this for a small fee. And the general guidance is to test roughly every 3 years, so you're not guessing at what your soil already has. Then look for a fertilizer where the middle number, phosphorus, is noticeably higher than the first number, nitrogen, and where potassium, the third number, is at least moderate to high. That's a Bloom formula blend, and it's built to support flowering and fruit development instead of continued leaf growth. While you're at it, check your soil pH along with the nutrient levels. This part gets skipped a lot, and it shouldn't be, because pH affects how much of that phosphorus your plant can actually take up, no matter how much you apply. Tomatoes generally do best in soil with a pH somewhere around 6, due to say. If your soil test comes back noticeably outside that range, phosphorus can end up locked in the soil in a form your plant's roots can't absorb, which means you could buy the right fertilizer, apply it perfectly, and still not see the flowering response you're expecting. Garden lime raises pH if your soil tests too acidic, and elemental sulfur lowers it if your soil tests too alkaline. Your local extension office can tell you roughly how much of either to work in. Based on your specific soil test results, timing matters just as much as the blend. Don't just swap the fertilizer and keep feeding on the exact same schedule you've been using. That's not enough on its own. University extension guidance generally recommends fertilizing before you plant, and then holding off on additional feeding until the first fruit actually sets on the plant. Not just when flowers appear, but once you can see a small green fruit forming. After that first fruit sets, side dress with about 1.5 tablespoons of a complete fertilizer worked gently into the soil around the base of the plant, roughly every 2 weeks through the rest of the season. If you're growing in sandy soil, lean toward the more frequent end of that schedule. Since sandy soil drains nutrients faster than heavier clay soil holds on to them, watering plays a supporting role in sending the right signal too. It won't fix a nitrogen problem on its own, but it makes everything else in this plan work better. Extension guidance from Ohio State points to roughly 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week for a fruiting tomato plant, adjusted for rainfall, delivered deeply and consistently rather than a light daily sprinkle. Inconsistent watering stresses the plant in ways that compound whatever the nitrogen imbalance is already doing. So keeping moisture steady gives the rest of this plan a fair chance to actually show results. If your tomato is growing in a container rather than in the ground, don't run this plan exactly the same way you would in the ground. Adjust both fertilizer and water slightly upward instead. Since potting mix drains and dries out faster than garden soil and holds on to less residual nutrition between feedings, container plant on that same 2-week side dressing schedule may need a light half-strength feeding in the off week if its leaves start looking pale, which is a different problem entirely from the one you're fixing here and is worth watching for so you don't overcorrect into an actual deficiency. 2 supporting nutrients are worth adding while you're sending the right signal. Though neither one is the main fix, don't reach for these instead of doing the fertilizer and timing work above, only alongside it. Calcium helps prevent blossom end rot, which becomes more likely once your plant is finally setting fruit and pulling water and nutrients toward it, working a source of calcium, like crushed eggshells or gypsum, into the soil around the base of the plant, gives your fruit a better foundation as it develops. Magnesium plays a supporting role in fruit set as well. And a foliar spray of about 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt per gallon of water, applied roughly every 2 weeks, is a common way homegrowers supply it directly to the leaves. One more thing to keep watching for during this step, especially if your vegetable garden sits close to your lawn. Lawn fertilizers are almost always heavy in nitrogen, since that's exactly what drives the thick green grass most people want. And if your tomato bed borders the lawn, runoff from watering or rain can carry some of that nitrogen straight into your garden soil without you ever applying it there directly. If your tomato keeps showing this pattern even after you've worked through steps 1 and 2, take a look at whether your lawn care schedule lines up with a recent feeding, and consider a buffer strip of unfertilized soil or a shallow border between the 2 areas. If it turns out that's part of what's going on, step 3 is watching for the proof. And this is the part that tells you steps 1 and 2 are actually working. Think of it as a rough 4-stage roadmap, not a strict deadline. On day 1, right after you skip that nitrogen feeding and give your plant a deep watering, nothing visible changes yet. And that's completely normal. So don't read anything into it. By around day 7, keep an eye on that same growing tip from earlier. Most growers notice it start to look a little less frantic, with new leaf growth slowing down just slightly compared to how the plant's been growing all season. That's usually the earliest real sign. The signal is shifting. By around day 14, flower clusters tend to hold on longer instead of drying up and falling within a day or 2 of opening, and new blossoms often start forming further up the plant instead of clustering only near the base, somewhere around day 21. Fruit set tends to follow once pollination has a stable flower to work with, usually showing up first as small green marbles at the base of a bloom that actually stuck around instead of dropping. That's the moment this whole plan was really building toward. This isn't a guarantee down to the exact day, and some plants move a little faster or slower depending on variety and conditions, but it's a realistic picture of what following this plan tends to look like in practice. One last check for this step: once you start seeing those small green fruits forming, gently cup one in your hand without pulling on it. If it feels firm rather than soft, your plant is committing real resources to it, which is a good sign that all 3 steps are actually landing the way they're supposed to. Picture that same plant a few weeks from now, still thick, still leafy, but with real clusters of green tomatoes finally hanging where flowers used to just drop away. The plant was never lazy, and it was never sick, and you were never doing something careless by feeding it well. It was just waiting for a signal. You hadn't sent it yet, buried under all that good intention nitrogen. Once it gets that signal, it does what it was built to do, the same thing it would have done all along if the timing and the ratio had lined up sooner